Hi folks, Jeremy Cline with you. Coming to you today from the Deer Island Princess 2, which is one of the auto ferries to Deer Island. So I'll just give you a shot around. We're currently passing through Big Lateet Passage, which is just off the Lateet ferry landing. I'll show you here. So right now we're passing through small channel that the ferry passes through. I'll just give you an idea here. So the Deer Island Princess 2 is capable of, when it's clean, at its highest RPM on both engines, is capable of approximately 11.4 knots. So we're in the middle of the channel just about now. So we're going against the tide right now in a ferry capable of doing 11.4 knots, and I'll show you how fast we're actually going.
Speeding up now.
Yeah.
Come faster.
Yeah.
Make sure you tube it.
Yeah. So now we're starting to speed up a bit more, but figure we were making way at about 5 knots at the slowest there, which means the tide was doing roughly between 5 and 6 knots. Right now, the tide cycle is at its strongest here in the spring. Someone in really good shape, that's a really good paddler, has a really good technique, may be able to make 5 knots headway, but you won't be able to sustain that for very long. So in a channel like that, if you time the tide right, it can really help you, or if you're going against it, you won't make any headway at all because you're unable to paddle as fast as that water is moving. Something you need to keep in mind when kayaking in an area like this. So we're now coming up on Little Lateet Passage, which is a smaller channel, of course, than Big Lateet Passage. There's a tremendous amount of water that flows through there. When it flows out, it flows past Scope Point, which we just came through, and it also goes around Jameson's and Parker's towards the Deer Island ferry landing and into the Irish Channel and out to sea that way. So there are all kinds of little channels where the tide is really strong and will prevent you from making headway. So right now I'll show you down through Little Lateet Passage towards St. Andrews. It's a very, very good spot for kayaking if you time the tide right again. There's actually a beach on Pendleton Island. Pendleton's just around the corner here, which we can't see, but I'll show you. Get a little bit of an idea that the amount of tide that's running right now just off of that that navigational buoy. A fair amount of tide running off of it. You can see the eddies here right off the side of the ferry.
The velocity of the tide in and around Deer Island is due in part to the amount of water that's coming into the Bay of Fundy, a portion of which comes in and around Deer Island. Shown here is Passamaquoddy Bay. On the left is Big Lateet. You can see the discoloration as the flood tide comes in. So flood tide coming in Big Lateet, Little Lateet in the middle, and off on the right is Pendleton's Passage. So that tide comes on this side of Deer Island through those 3 passages, and on the south side around Deer Island Point. The strength of the tide in this area is strong enough that the point just above the base of the arrow between Deer Island and Eastport actually creates the world's second largest whirlpool. That's how strong that is in that area. Now on the ebb tide, as the tide's coming out, all of the water in Passamaquoddy Bay and up the St. Croix River must empty out around the island, which creates, again, a very high velocity in some channels. Tides around Deer Island will go through a half a cycle, so from a high water to low water in just over 6 hours, roughly 6 hours 15 minutes. Now I've shown Leonardville, Deer Island here to illustrate how much water has to move. So in that 6 hours and 15 minutes, on a spring tide, there's a differential of roughly 30 feet. Now at the head of the bay, up near the New Brunswick, Nova Scotia border, that's upwards to 50 feet. So you can just imagine how much water is moving through these small channels, and that's why we have that velocity that you have to keep in mind.
Now as we come towards the ferry landing, I'll line the camera up along the length of the ferry and take note of how it'll kind of appear that the wharf is moving against the background, and that's actually the ferry being shifted with the tide one way or the other. Now it should look like the wharf is moving to the right when we go towards it, depending on how the guy that's running the ferry brings us into it. I'll show you here. This is just how tide will affect you. Your course and your heading can be two different degrees on your compass.
So what the captain's actually doing here is bringing the heading, the direction the ferry is pointed to the right, so it's stemming the tide, it's going into the tide, and the course is actually headed to the wharf, so the wharf doesn't appear to move. Again, this technique is called stemming the tide, and it's one of the most efficient ways to travel across the tide race.
Some of the many things you have to keep in mind when paddling